Of all tropes, the most interesting to the moralist is that which defines a life, and marks its course from birth to death in some human creature. But life is also the most crucial of tropes for the natural philosopher, for here his congenial mathematical categories leave him in the lurch, and he must either recognize their inadequacy to express the intimate flux of substance, or else cut his world in two, appending a purely literary or moral psychology to his mathematical physics. If emotional life preoccupies him, he cannot simply ignore it. He may even be tempted to revert to the most primitive of dualisms and to conceive the flux of existence as the resultant of two opposite agents, one an inert matter only capable of sinking into a dead sea of indistinction, the other a supernatural spirit, intrinsically disembodied, but swooping down occasionally upon that torpid matter like the angel into the pool of Bethesda, and stirring it for a while into life and shape. Need I give reasons, after all that has preceded, for discarding this last conception? In the first place, it would be a materialistic and superstitious view of spirit to regard it as a wind, an effort, or any kind of physical force. On the other hand, in conceiving matter to be inert, merely heavy, and intrinsically blank, we should be forgetting our original reason for positing matter at all, and instead of that existing substance filling the field of action and necessarily fertile and everything to be encountered there, we should be considering some casual symbol for matter, such as ignorant sensation or abstract science may have created. To say that matter as it truly exists is inert or incapable of spontaneous motion, organization, life, or thought would be flatly to contradict the facts, because the real matter, posited in action, and active in our bodies and in all other instruments of action, evidently possesses and involves all those vital properties. Nevertheless, the venerable tradition which attributes the fashioning of the body to the soul might be retained, if only we could restore to the word soul all its primitive earthliness, potency, and mystery. Soul, as often in antiquity, would then signify an animating current widely diffused throughout the cosmos, a breath uncreated and immortal as a whole, but at each point entering some particular body and quitting it, in order to mingle again with the air, the light, the nether darkness, or the life of the god from which it came. Such a warm, fluid, transmissible agent would evidently be material. Industry requires hands. A traceable cause of specific motions must travel through space in particular channels. And indeed, that the soul was material was once taken for granted both in India and in Greece. On the other hand, the Platonic and Christian tradition has come to identify the soul with a bodiless spirit, a sort of angel, at first neglecting and afterwards denying the biological functions which were the primitive essence of the soul, until in modern times the soul has been discarded altogether and its place taken by consciousness, something which in reality is the last and most highly conditioned of the works of a natural soul. Thus a soul or an angel became, for the Christian imagination, a supernatural substance, a personal spirit without material organs, yet somehow still capable of seeing, loving, and thinking, and even of exercising physical force and making its presence felt in particular places. In man, and perhaps in other creatures, an evil fate had imprisoned some of these angelic souls in a natural body, and contaminated them with the vital principle, the old animal heathen soul proper to such a body. Sometimes under the influence of Aristotle and of the apostolic doctrine of the resurrection of the flesh, theologians have endeavored to bridge the chasm between these two souls, one generative and the other degenerate. Thus, the Orthodox Catholic doctrine declares that by a special act of creation, a rational, immortal soul, previously non-existent, is substituted during gestation for the animal soul of the embryo. the new supernatural soul taking on the functions of the previous natural soul in addition to its own, and by that union becoming subject to their influence, an influence which marks the fallen state of the supernatural soul and its participation in the sin of Adam. A forced conjunction of two incompatible beings is obvious here, yet this conjunction is not without its dramatic propriety in expressing theoretically the moral conflicts of the Christian life, and the same incongruities reappear in any doctrine which would make the soul immaterial and its functions physical. A soul essentially generative and directive must be capable of existing unconsciously and of exerting material energy. If it were ever clearly identified with consciousness, it would evaporate into a passing feeling or thought, something unsubstantial, volatile, evanescent, non-measurable and non-traceable. Once recognized in its spiritual actuality, this thought would not only be obviously incapable of exercising the vegetative and propulsive functions of animal life, but would loudly call for such an animal life to support its own intuitions and lend them their place in nature and their moral significance. Avoiding, then, this poetical word, the soul, laden with so many equivocations, I will beg the reader to distinguish sharply two levels of life in the human body, one of which I will call the spirit, and the other the psyche. By spirit, I understand the actual light of consciousness falling upon anything, the ultimate invisible emotional fruition of life and feeling and thought. On the other hand, by the psyche, I understand a system of tropes, inherited or acquired, displayed by living bodies in their growth and behavior. This psyche is a specific form of physical life, present and potential, asserting itself in any plant or animal. It will bend to circumstances, but if bent too much, it will suddenly snap. The animal or plant will die, and the matter hitherto controlled by that psyche will be scattered. Such a moving equilibrium is at once vital and material, these qualities not being opposed, but coincident. Some parcels of matter, called seeds, are predetermined to grow into organisms of a specific habit, producing similar seeds in their turn. Such a habit in matter is a psyche. In literary psychology, this psychic often means simply the mental, and the reader may be disconcerted by the suggestion that the truly psychic, the dynamic life of both body and mind is on the contrary material. Let me remind him, in that case, of the following fundamental points. 1. The psyche is not another name for consciousness or mind. Everything truly conscious or mental, feeling, intuition, intent, belongs to the realm of spirit. You may say of spirit, but not of the psyche, that its essence is to think. The psyche is a natural fact. The fact that many organisms are alive, can nourish and reproduce themselves, and on occasion can feel and think. This is not merely a question of the use of words, it is a deliberate refusal to admit the possibility of any mental machinery. The machinery of growth, instinct, and action, like the machinery of speech, is all physical. But this sort of physical operation is called psychical, because it falls within the trope of a life, and belongs to the self-defense and self-expression of a living organism. How should any unsophisticated person doubt that the movements of matter have the nature of matter for their principle, and not the nature of spirit? 2. By the word matter, I do not understand any human idea of matter, popular or scientific, ancient or recent. Matter is properly a name for the actual substance of the natural world, whatever that substance may be. It would therefore be perfectly idle and beside the point to make some arbitrary idea of matter and to prove dialectically that from that idea none of the consequences follow with which the true substance of the world is evidently pregnant. What would be thereby proved would not be that matter cannot have the developments which it has, but that that particular idea of matter was wrong or at least inadequate. 3. In calling the psyche material, I do not mean to identify her with any piece or kind of substance, an atom or monad or ether or energy. Perhaps all sorts of substances may enter into her system. She is not herself a substance, except relatively to consciousness. of which her movements and harmonies are the organ and the immediate support. She is a mode of substance, a trope or habit established in matter. She is made of matter as a cathedral is made of stone, or the worship in it of sounds and motions, but only their respective forms and moral functions render the one a cathedral or a rite, and the other a psyche. 4. The whole life of the psyche, even if hidden by chance from human observation, is essentially observable. It is the object of biology. Such is the only scientific psychology, as conceived by the ancients, including Aristotle, and now renewed in behaviorism and psychoanalysis. This conception of the psyche also allows the adepts of psychical research to retain a congenial name for the very real region, far removed from everything that I call spiritual, in which occult processes, unusual powers, and subtle survivals may be actually discovered. Biology aspires to be a part of physics, and this for the best of reasons, since in describing the spontaneous tropes that prevail in the flux of matter, physics is simply biology universalized. The problem is not where to place the frontier between two disparate regions, but only to discover how the tropes most obviously in each of them are superposed or grow out of one another. The inanimate world must needs concern the zoologist, since it pervades and unites all living creatures. And the animate world must needs concern the psychist, since it is the crown of nature, the focus where matter concentrates its fires and best shows what it is capable of doing. Obviously, if we can understand the inmost machinery of motion, we should understand life, which on the biological level is simply a system of motions. In one sense, indeed, all matter is alive. Its deadest principles, like gravity and inertia, are principles of motion. The dry dust and the still waters which the wind sweeps into a vortex, if mingled, will breed. Even celestial matter, which might seem too tenuous and glowing to be alive after our fashion, is fertile in light, which may be perhaps the primary stimulus to life, or a first form of it. Yet this universal ethereal trepidation is too diffuse and elusive to seem life to our human judgment, accustomed as we are to the crude contrast between a barking dog and a dead one. Even in animals and plants, the life in which, so to speak, nature is interested, the life which is transmitted and preserved, is not their individual life, describable in a biography. Its vegetative continuity takes a course which, from our point of view, seems subterranean and unfriendly, for it does not pass from one complete animal or plant to the next, as the phases of each life succeed one another for the observant spirit. But the child buds at mid-branch, and the tree obdurately outlives its seeded flowers. In fact, individuality and tenacity never are more pronounced than in that old age which, as far as the life of nature is concerned, is so much dead wood and obstructive rubbish. Life at our level has adopted a vehicle which, like all natural vehicles, has a form and a story of its own, apart from the inherited movement which it serves to propagate. The individual has outgrown his character of a mere moment in a flux. His trope is not simply the general trope repeated and passed on. It has become a redundant trope, surrounding that other with epicycles and arabesques and prolongations useless to the march of transmissible life, yet enriching it at its several stations. It is only metaphorically, therefore, that the general movement of nature can be called alive, or said to be animated by a cosmic psyche. Nor would the attribution of these tropes to the universe as a whole explain why they should arise again within it. On the contrary, it is more natural to find fish in the sea than within other fishes. We may rather say that matter, although perhaps everywhere organic or at least ready to be organized, becomes animate only when it forms hereditary organisms, and that A psyche exists only in bodies that can assimilate and redistribute the substances suitable for preserving and propagating their type. Thus, the cosmos, not feeding or breeding, can have no psyche, but only psyches within it. And the spirit is no psyche, but always has some psyche beneath, which sustains it. Embryology, the most obscure part of biology, is accordingly the fundamental part of it. In the present state of knowledge, the psychologist is condemned to taking summary and superficial views of his subject, for he sees gross results, gross variations, gross repetitions, and all the fine individual intricate labor of the psyche escapes him. Physiology and organic chemistry work only with ready-made materials which already possess inexplicable specific virtues and habits, and psychoanalysis, in really opening a trap door, as disease does, into the dim carpentry of the stage, is compelled to transcribe that intricacy into metaphors. Its reports come to it in hectic language, the latest, most wayward, most hypocritical ebullition of psychic life, while its own theories, for lack of physiological knowledge, must be couched in mythological terms. Thus the psyche remains a mystery in her intrinsic operations, and if something of that mystery seems to hang about the feminine name we are giving her, so much the better. We are warned that we do not and probably cannot understand. What our knowledge of the psyche lacks in precision, it makes up, after a fashion, in variety and extent. All that is called knowledge of the world, of human nature, of character, and of the passions is a sort of auscultation of the psyche. And the familiarity of our verbal and dramatic conventions often blinds us to their loose application and to a profound ignorance of the true mechanism of life. Not knowing what we are, we at least can discourse abundantly about our books, our words, and our social actions, and these manifestations of the psyche, though peripheral, are faithful enough witnesses to her nature. She is that inner moving equilibrium from which these things radiate, and which they help to restore, the equilibrium by which we live, in the sense of not dying, and to keep us alive in her first and essential function. It follows naturally from this biological office that in each of us she is one, vigilant and predetermined, that she is selfish and devoted, intrepid and vicious, intelligent and mad, for her quick potentialities are solicited and distracted by all sorts of accidents. She slept at first in a seed, there and from there, as the seed softened, she distributed her organs and put forth her energies, always busier and busier in her growing body, almost losing control of her members, yet reacting from the center, perhaps only slowly and partially, upon events at her frontiers. If too deeply thwarted, her industry becomes distraction, and what we sometimes call her plan, which is only her propensity, may be developed and transformed, if she finds new openings, until it becomes quite a different plan. But against brutal obstacles she will struggle until death, that is, until her central control, her total equilibrium and power of recuperation are exhausted. Her death may as easily occur by insurrection within her organism, each part of which is a potential center on its own account, as by hostile action from outside. I hardly venture to say more. To watch a plant grow or draw in its leaves, to observe the animals in the zoological garden, is to gain some knowledge of the psyche. To study embryology or the nervous system or insanity or politics is, or ought to be, to gain more, and every system of science or religion is rich in this sort of instruction for a critic who studies it in order to distinguish whatever may be arbitrary in it, based on human accidents, and without any but a psychic ground. All the errors ever made about other things, if we understand their cause, enlighten us about ourselves, for the psyche is at once the spring of curiosity and the ground of refraction, selection, and distortion in our ideas. Summary reaction, symbolization, infection with relativity, and subjective coloring begins in the senses and is continued in the passions, and if we succeed in removing by criticism this personal equation from our science of other things, part withdrawn, which remains on our hands, is our indirect knowledge of the psyche. Each man also has direct experience of the psyche within himself, not so much in his verbal thoughts and distinct images, which if they are knowledge at all are knowledge of other things, as in a certain sense of his personal momentum, a pervasive warmth and power in the inner man. As he thinks and acts intent on external circumstances, he is not unaware of the knot of latent, determinate impulses within him which respond to those circumstances. Our thoughts, which we may be said to know well, and that we know we have had them often before, are about anything and everything. We shuffle and iterate them, and live in them a verbal, heated, histrionic life. Yet we little know why we have them, or how they arise and change. Nothing could be more obscure, more physical than the dynamics of our passions and dreams. Yet, especially in moments of suspense or hesitation, nothing could be more intensely felt. There is the coursing of the blood, the waxing and waning of the affections, the thousand starts of smothered eloquence, the coming on of impatience, of invention, of conviction, of sleep. There are laughter and tears ready to flow, quite unbidden, and almost at random. There is our holdfast, as it were, knocking at the door. There are our silent hopes. There are our future discourses and decisions working away, like actors rehearsing their parts, at their several fantastic arguments. All this is the psyche's work, and in that sense deeply our own, and our superficial mind is carried by it, like a child, cooing or fretting in his mother's arms. Much of it we feel going on unmistakably within our bodies, and the whole of it in fact goes on there. But the form which belongs to it in its true physical and psychic character, in its vital bodily tropes, is even less known to us than the mechanism of the heart, or that by which our nerves receive, transmit, and return their signals. The psyche is an object of experience to herself, since what she does at one moment or in one organ she can observe, perhaps, a moment later, or with another organ. Yet of her life as a whole she is aware only as we are aware of the engines and the furnaces in the ship in which we travel, half asleep, or chattering on deck, or as we are aware of a foreign language heard for the first time, perceived in its globular sound and gesticulation, and even perhaps in its general issue, that all is probably a dispute about money. Yet without distinguishing the words or the reasons for those precise passionate outbursts. In this way we all endure, without understanding, the existence and the movement of our own psyche, for it is the body that speaks and the spirit that listens. The psyche is the self which a man is proud or ashamed of, or probably both at once, not his body in its accidental form, age, and diseases, from which he instinctively distinguishes those initial impulses and thwarted powers which are much more truly himself. And this is a self which, if he lives in a religious age, he may say that he wishes to save, or to find reviving in another world. Yet this self is far from being a stranger to the body. On the contrary, it is more deeply and persistently the essence of the body than it is the body itself. It is human, male or female, proper to a particular social and geographical zone. It is still the fountain of youth and old age. It deprecates in a measure the actions and words which circumstances may have drawn from it, and which it feels do it enormous injustice. And yet the words and actions which it might have wished to produce instead are all words and actions of the same family, slightly more eloquent in the same human language, slightly more glorious in the same social sphere. The psyche is so much of us and of our works as in our own doing. Conflicts between the flesh and the spirit, between habit and idea, between passion and reason, are real conflicts enough. But they are conflicts between one moment in the psyche and another moment there. Hers is a compound life, molded by compromise and compacted of tentative organs, with their several impulses, all initially blind and mechanical. Rarely will any particular psychic impulse or habit move in sympathy with all the rest. or be unquestionably dominant. It follows that what in religion or in moral reflection we call the spirit is a precarious harmony. It is threatened by subject powers always potentially rebellious, and it necessarily regards them as wicked and material insofar as they do not conspire to keep its own flame vivid and pure, and yet the spirit itself has no other fuel. Reason is not a force contrary to the passions, but a harmony possible among them. Except in their interest it could have no ardor, and, except in their world, it could have no point of application. Nothing to beautify, nothing to dominate. It is therefore by a complete illusion, though an excusable one, that the spirit denies its material basis, and calls its body a prison or a tomb. The impediments are real, but mutual. And sometimes the second nucleus of passion or fleshiness rises against that nucleus which the spirit expresses, and takes the name of spirit in its turn. Every virtue, and in particular knowledge and thought, have no other root in the world than the coordination of their organs with one another and with the material habitat. Certainly such a coordination could never arise except in a psyche. The psyche is another name for it. But neither could the psyche have any life to foster and defend, nor any instruments for doing so, if she were not a trope arising in a material flux and enjoyed a visible dominance there more or less prolonged and extended. Thus the first function of the psyche in the seed is to create the outer body. With every organ which she brings forth, she acquires a new office and a new type of life. These changes and developments are not devised and suggested to the psyche by some disembodied spirit whispering in her ear. Were they not the natural condition of her innate tensions, she would be justified in regarding these promptings as deceits and snares of the devil. Or from the point of view of the psyche, whose innate impulse is the arbiter of morals, every change of purpose is a change for the worse, either a vain complication or a hideous surrender. It is only lateral tensions, circumstances, external pressure, that can compel her to recast her habits and become, to that extent, a new psyche. Surrenders are indeed inevitable when the action for which the soul is ready happens to be impossible, or organs once agile are atrophied by disuse, and new acquisitions of function are inevitable too, when new occasions induce a different mode of action, and preserve and solidify it. The burden of the psyche is in this way continually lightened in one quarter and accumulated in another. If crippled at first by some loss, she may ultimately heal the wound, healing being one of her primary functions, and may live on with her residual equipment all the more nimbly. On the other hand, she often hardens herself to some novel exertion, which at first was forced and distracting, until that exercise becomes instinctive and necessary to her health and peace, so that it is performed with alacrity and sureness whenever an occasion occurs. Habituation tames the spirit, or rather kills it in one form and recreates it in another. This forced attention to instrumentalities, this awkwardness, which marks the acquisition of a new art, yields in time to love and mastery, and the spirit rises again from its troubles and threatened death to happiness and confidence. At bottom, however, the whole psyche is a burden to herself, a terrible inner compulsion to care, to watch, to pursue, and to possess. Yet to evade this predestined career would be a worse fate, and the psyche is more terribly corroded and tormented for not doing than she would be harassed in doing, or disappointed at having done. Original sin must be purged, the burden discharged, the message delivered. Happiness, for the surface of the psyche is normally happy, lies for her in jogging on without too much foresight or retrospect, along the middle way, exercising her central functions heartily, and reverting to them. as to hearth and home, from those gamblers' losses or commitments into which she may be tempted. In this way, she may healthfully deliver herself in a long life of her native burden, transmit the same in a healthful measure, and sleep in peace. Sleep is in a manner the normal condition of the psyche, from which in her vegetative and somatic labors she never awakes, unless it be to suffer, and we may fancy that a sort of sub-soul or potential life sleeps, and will always sleep, in the universe of matter, ready to shape it, when opportunity occurs, into the likeness of all essence. Yet as this labor must be in time, and in some one of many alternative courses, the greater part of that sleeping psyche remains unoccupied, and the occupied part anxious and full of fear of death, from which indeed she cannot escape, except by falling asleep again and forgetting, but never really removing, the peril of a new birth. To be completely mastered by the psyche makes the health, agility, and beauty of the body. This sort of virtue is common among the brutes. It would seem to suffice that a very potent psyche, one to which its matter completely submits, should have entrenched herself in the seed, and should surround it later with outworks so staunch and perfect that no ordinary hazard will pierce or bend them. Unquestioning fidelity to type is always a marvel, the victory of form over matter, which delights the contemplative spirit. In fragile organisms such as children or flowers, this fidelity seems to us an appealing innocence. But in hard-shell organisms, which attempt to resist change by force of rigidity, it seems rather stupid. Brave and proud the conservative psyche may be, she will not suffer minor accidents to distract her from her first vows and native intentions. But against major accidents she has no resource save a total death, and on earth she must be extraordinarily prolific to survive at all. The peculiarity of the human psyche, on the contrary, is her great relative plasticity. I will not call it intelligence, because that presupposes a fixed good to be attained, and invention only a new means of attaining it. The total plasticity, that for greater convenience consents to change its most radical direction, would hardly be life. Its only assignable purpose would seem to be survival, and even this would be illusory, since the psyche that was to survive would have abdicated in doing so, and would have committed suicide. This the human soul is capable of doing, morally as well as physically, as we see in madness, in conversion, and in the wilder passions. But ordinarily her plasticity remains only a means to a native end, an incidental adjustment in the interest of the major radical passions, which remain supreme at the center. Yet this alert human psyche, more intelligent than wise, often forgets the treasure locked in the citadel, and lives by preference in her own suburbs, and the outer organs of action and perception. She then becomes distracted, frivolous, loquacious, and we may doubt whether all this agitation and knowingness relieve her of her inner burden, or only add a dreadful fatigue to a profound dissatisfaction. Nor is this all. Friction at the periphery more or less recoils to the center and modifies the organization there. Changes of food, temperature, climate, and rhythm may extend to the very substance of the seed whence the next generation is to grow, so that the psyche transmitted is not always exactly similar to the psyche inherited. In the history of the earth, the evolution and transformation of psyches must have gone on from the beginning, and this reconstruction, which in some direction seems to have come to a temporary end and produced stable types of animals, and the human race still continues at an unusual rate, not so much in the body unless we regard clothes and weapons as equivalents to fur and claws, but in the singular equipment with instruments by which modern man has surrounded himself, and in the management of which he lives. The changes are so rapid that we can observe and record them, something perhaps impossible and inconceivable to any psyche except the human. All this may be studied and described behavioralistically, as a chapter in natural history. Yet we know that the psyche so occupied has an inner invisible experience, which under these circumstances becomes very complex. The eloquence of language, the multitude of sights and sounds, the keen edge of silent emotion compose a perpetual waking dream, a view of the world which is not a part of the world, and which even in sleep continues and shifts fantastically in many immediate development. This unsubstantial experience, which is alone immediate, is nothing new or paradoxical in kind. The psyche is probably never unconscious. She always feels in some vague emotional form the inherent stress of her innumerable operations. Her maturing instincts have their false dawn in her mind. She warns and awakes for a moment at their satisfaction, and simmers pleasantly when replete. But external perception is a keener, more inquisitive form of attention. It is less interested in what is given aesthetically, or even in what might be given, than in the action of things upon one another and on our bodies. At the same time, perception cannot fail to supply us with images, products of the inner psyche, like the feelings of blind animals, which serve to name and to clothe in our poetic consciousness those external objects of her concern. These images and those feelings, together with the constant flow of unspoken words which we call thinking, compose a mental or inner life. Its moments, though probably intent on external material events, are yet directly but symptoms of psychic movements, so that it requires only a shift in apperception to transform all this immediate experience from active consideration of dubious external objects into a certain and accurate index to an internal psychic life. Not that these moments of spirit, these mental notes and mental vistas are the psychic life in question. They form a thin flux of consciousness. Not that these moments of spirit, these mental notes and mental vistas are the psychic life in question. They form a thin flux of consciousness, chiefly verbal in most of us, which in reflective moods becomes self-conscious, recollection, autobiography, and literature, all only the topmost synthesis, or play of shooting relations on the surface of the unconscious. In this capacity, however, as a mental symptom or expression, self-consciousness gives infallible renderings of the agitation beneath, insofar as we can recollect it or reconstruct it to describe the psyche and her passions, just as we use the essences given in perception to describe pictorially those parts of the material world on which the organs of perception react. Hence, a second approach to a science of the psyche, this time not biological or behavioralistic, but personal, through memory and repeatable mental discourse, and this imagination of imagination may fill our whole lives, composing a dramatic, social, religious world in which we suppose ourselves to be living. Such a moral world, the world of humanism, need not mislead and practice the psyche that creates it. Sometimes she may become more interested in this play world, in religion, landscape fiction, and eloquence, than in her natural circumstances. Yet all her imaginative life is interfused with language and akin to language, so that it often becomes a convenient or indispensable transcript for the march of things on a human scale. It might be so disciplined and adjusted to facts as to compose history and literary psychology. The two sorts of psychology, the scientific and the literary, are clearly distinguished by Aristotle, where he says that anger is a name for two different things, anger being physically a boiling of the humors and dialectically a desire for revenge. A desire for revenge is a current verbal and dramatic expression for such a passion. This too is summary and might be elaborated in each case into an almost infinite network of motives, memories, likes and dislikes, and delicate juxtapositions of images and words. Yet whatever figments we might substitute for the conventional terms anger or desire would be further literary figments, verbal or intuitive units formed and reformed by the discoursing spirit and non-existent in the realm of matter. For this reason, the most adequate and confident knowledge of human nature, rendered in literary terms, as in novels and plays, or in the gossip of busybodies, covers only what might be called the reasoned element in life, although it is for the most part foolish at bottom. The same psychology remains helpless in the presence of all the radical passions and all the natural collocations of persons and events by which the life of mind is determined. Literature and literary philosophy are nevertheless the most natural and eloquent witnesses to the life of the psyche. Literature is conserved speech, speech is significant song, and song is a pure overflow of the psyche in her moments of free play and vital leisure. And this overflow is itself double, biological and ontological. Biologically, it resembles the exuberance of the psyche in all her well-fed and happy moments, in the gambols of young animals, the haughtiness of all accomplished strength, or the endless experimentation in colors, forms, and habits characteristic of the psyche in fashioning her strange menagerie of bodies. Yet the ontological overflow, the concomitant emergence of consciousness, alone seems to arrest the wonder, not to say the wrath, of philosophers. And they are so surprised at it, and so wrathful, that they are inclined to deny it, and to call it impossible. I have not myself such an intrinsic knowledge of matter as to be sure that it cannot do that which it does. Nor do I see why the proudest man should be ashamed of the parents who, after all, have produced him. I am not tempted seriously to regard consciousness as the very essence of life or even of being. On the contrary, both my personal experience and the little I know of nature at large absolutely convince me that consciousness is the most highly conditioned of existences, an overtone of psychic strains, mutations, and harmonies. Nor does its origin seem more mysterious to me than that of everything else. Let us, in this important matter, go back to first principles. From the beginning, it was in the very nature of existence to be involved in indirect commitments. Being transitive, anything existing is always in the act of becoming something which it was not, and yet which it was the sufficient cause for producing, according to those irresponsible impulses which animate its matter and predetermine its fate. The sequel is always spontaneous, and, if we are not dulled by habit, seems miraculous, yet is always natural, since no other development would have been more so, and some development was inevitable. Nature is not that realm of essence where all variety and all relations are perspicuous and intrinsically necessary. Necessity in nature is only an irrational propulsion which, as a matter of fact, is prevalent. Existence could not have begun to be, it could not have taken the first step from one form of being to another, if it had not been radically mad. But this madness not only has method in it, a method in itself arbitrary and doubtless variable, it has also a certain glorious profusion, arising, cumulative intensity and volume, coming to a climax and then dying down. The flux thus runs inevitably into dramatic episodes, even in its own plane of matter. Episodes in our eyes far more interesting than its general movement, which is perhaps only itself an episode in some more radical genesis of existence. The tacit commitments of such existence are not limited to the material plane. Every fact involves many a truth about it. It casts its shadow through infinite distances and makes relevant to it everything that it resembles and everything that it contradicts. By arising and by disappearing, it introduces an unalterable event into history. It verifies or stultifies all prophecies concerning it and concerning the place which it fills in the context of nature, and which might have been filled otherwise, and it either justifies or renders false everything that anyone may say or think of it in the future. Here, then, is a whole infinite world, visible only to the intellect, but actually created and made precise by the blind flux of matter, whatsoever that flux may be. These are the indelible footprints which existence, thoughtlessly running on, neither knows nor cares that it is making, and which yet are its only memorial, its only redemption from death, the eternal truth about it. Now, when the flux falls into the trope which we call a psyche, existence commits itself unawares to yet another complication. For now, reverberation of its movement in the realm of truth becomes, so to speak, vocal and audible to itself, not indeed in its entirety, unless there be some divine sensorium to gather all its echoes together, but in snatches. At certain junctures, animal life, properly a habit in matter, bursts as with a peal of bells into a new realm of being, into the realm of spirit. When does this happen? And how is this consciousness diversified and guided? We may presume that some slumbering sensibility exists in every living organism as an echo or foretaste of its vital rhythms. And even when no assignable feeling comes to a head, if there is life at all, there is a sort of field of consciousness or canvas spread for attention, ready to be occupied by eventual figures. Not by any figures, as if essences of their own initiative could come down and appear, but only by certain predetermined classes and intensities of sensation possible to the particular organs whose suspended animation or busy growth spreads that canvas and brings that ground tone of potential feeling. When ambient influences or inner ripening modify this vital rhythm or cause the psyche actively to assimilate or to repel that stimulant, organic slumber may easily awake to some special feeling or image. Thus, sensations and ideas always follow upon organic reactions and express their quality, and intuition merely supplies a mental term for the animal reaction already at work unconsciously. With each new strain or fresh adjustment, a new feeling darts through the organism. Digestive sleep breaks into moral alertness and sharp perception, and once initiated, these modes of sensibility may persist even in quiescent hours, for they leave neurograms or seeds of habit in the brain, and may be revived in thought and in dreams. Consciousness, then, in its genesis and natural status, is one of the indirect but inevitable outpourings proper to an existence which is in flux and gathers itself into living bodies. In consciousness, the psyche becomes festive, lyrical, rhetorical. She caps her life by considering it and talking to herself about the absent parts of it. Consciousness is a spiritual synthesis of organic movements, and were it not this, no spirit and no consciousness would ever have any transcendent significance or any subject matter other than the essences which it might weave together. Yet, in fact, on account of its organic seat and material conditions, consciousness is significant. Its every datum is an index and may become in its eyes a symbol or its cause. In other words, consciousness is naturally cognitive. Its spiritual essence renders it an imponderable sublimation of organic life and invisible there. Yet it is attached historically, morally, and indicatively to its source, by being knowledge of it. Thus, like truth, consciousness is necessarily faithful to its basis in the flux of nature. It is a commentary on events. It is a commentary on events in the language of essence, and while its light is contemplative, its movement and intent strictly obey the life of the psyche in which it is kindled. Hence the whole assertive or dogmatic force of intelligence, by which the spirit ventures to claim knowledge of outspread facts, not merely to light up and inspect a given essence. This whole extraordinary pretension rests on a vital compulsion, native to the body, imposing animal faith on a spirit in itself contemplative. For in animals, the organs are inevitably addressed to intercourse with relevant external things, as well as to internal growth and reproduction. Suspense outwards towards an object not within her organism is habitual to the psyche. Her tentacles and her actions hang and grope in midair, like a drawbridge confidently let down to meet its appropriate ulterior point of contact and support. Even her vegetative life is prophetic, conscious of maturation and rich in preparations for coming crises, vaguely prefigured but unhesitatingly pursued. Under such circumstances and with such organs, consciousness could not be pure intuition, it must needs be intuition carried by intent. The intent is adventurous. Its object or ulterior development is hidden and merely posited. Yet by thus torturing itself and uprooting itself from its immediate datum, spirit becomes perception, and perception knowledge, in all its transitive and realistic force. And this perception and knowledge are, for the same reason, normally and virtually true. Not true literally, as the fond spirit imagines when it takes some given picture, summary, synthetic, and poetical for the essence of the world, but true as language may be true, symbolically, pragmatically, and for the range of human experience in that habitat and at that stage in its history. So much for the claims of spirit to possess knowledge, and for the range of it. But whence the original qualities of feeling itself, the choice of essences that shall appear in intuition, the spectrum of each sense, the logic and grammar of each type of intelligence? How does the psyche arrive at any of these creations, rather than at any other? Certainly out of her own substance, and by the natural diversity and fertility of the tropes which she imposes on her own matter. The presumption of common sense that these essences belong in the first place to objects and pass from them into the organs of sense, and somehow become evident to spirit in the dark caverns of the brain, is unfortunately untenable. We find it plausible in spite of its incoherence and the many contrary facts, because we begin our reflection at the end, armed with our working conventions and dogmatic habits. We should readily understand the enormous illusion involved and the false reduplication of our data if we began at the beginning, where in the natural world the psyche begins. Surely pleasure and pain, hunger, lust, and fear do not first reside in external objects and pass from them into the mind, and these are the primary typical data of intuition. All the rest, colors, sounds, shapes, special spaces and times and sensations of motion, is hatched in the same nest. It all has a similar psychic seat and dramatic occasion. If such essences seem to be found in external things, it is for the good and sufficient reason that outer things are perceived by us in these sensible terms, and could not be perceived were not the psyche sensitive and fertile in such signals to the spirit. All things might stand facing one another forever, clad in all the colors of the rainbow, and were there no poetic psyche in any of them, to turn those colors into feelings of color and intuitions of the soul, never would anything perceive anything else. The psyche is a poet, a creator of language, and there is no presumption that she will perceive material things, including her own substance and movement, at all in the terms or in the order and scale in which they exist materially. On the contrary, only the reactions of her organism are represented in her feelings, and these reactions, which are tropes subsisting only in the realm of truth, resemble in nothing the imponderable feelings which are involved in executing them. The fountain of sense and of sensible qualities lies indeed in the forward and inner tensions of natural moments, with their conjunctions and flow in the psyche. Pain, novel in essence, signalizes a special nervous affection, not another pain elsewhere, and this signal is suitable inasmuch as just such a cry would be uttered by any psyche in such a predicament, and for all psyches signifies predicaments of that sort. The whole of life is a predicament, complex and prolonged, and the whole of mind is the cry, prolonged and variously modulated, which that predicament wrings from the psyche. After the spirit is born, and in the midst of business has begun to take note silently of the actual aspects and essences of things, the psyche may extend her action with more circumspection in what we call the arts. That pause, as we may think it, for wonder and contemplation, was only, from her housewife's point of view, a pause for breath, In stopping to gaze, she gives herself time to readjust her impulses and increase her range, having, among other organs, formed the human hand. She may proceed through that instrument to transform matter outside her body, so that artificial instruments and works become, as it were, organs of the psyche too. With this extension of her instruments, her spirit, which is the function of them in act, also extends its basis. From her center, where the spirit lives, she may now control and watch a whole political, industrial, and learned world. Civilization may accumulate for her benefit a great fund of traditions, which will foster the spirit systematically and direct it rationally. Just as in the growth of the embryo there was a marvelous precision and timeliness in the production of the various organs hereditary in the species, so in animal society there is a great, though much looser, predetermination of what the art shall produce. Art, as I use the word here, implies moral benefit, the impulsive modification of matter by man to his own confusion and injury. I shall not call art, but vice or folly. The tropes of art must be concentric with those of health in the psyche, otherwise they would not on the whole extend her dominion or subserve her need of discharging her powers. Nature is everywhere full of vices, partly apathetic, and that the impulse at work does not avail to transmute new matter into its instrument, and partly aberrant, in that the impulse itself runs wild and destroys instead of buttressing its original organ, for without an organ an impulse can neither exist nor operate. Thus the psyche continually creates diseases in her substance, or invents scourges and trammels to oppress her from without, as does a false civilization through the mad work of her own hands. These aberrations, if extreme, soon defeat themselves by the ruin which they cause, but often they interweave themselves permanently into the strong woof of life, rendering life wretched but not impossible. In the very inertia of habit, however, as in inveterate vices, there may be certain luxury or compensation. Impulse, having taken to that trope, may find a certain pleasure in repeating it, a sort of dogged allegiance and sense of rightness, more intimately native and satisfying than any overt proof of its folly. The virtuous human soul, so to speak, is then long dead and buried, and the omnivorous vice has become a soul in its stead. We are compacted of devils. Love and conscience, like the rest, are initially irrational, and the conservative inner man may strenuously cling to methods in art and to forms of sentiment which defeat his eventual rational nature. The fatal imperative of his daemon may lie deeper in him than any ulterior claim of beauty or happiness. Thus the spiritual function of the psyche is added to her generative and practical functions, creating a fresh and unprecedented realm of being, the realm of spirit, with its original aesthetic spectrum and moral range and values incommensurable with anything but themselves. Yet this whole evocation is a concomitant function of the same psyche which presides over bodily growth and action. Were it not so, spirit would have no place in time or in nature, no relevance to existence, and indeed no existence of its own. And even if by a flight of mythological fancy we imagine it existing disembodied, it would thereby have forfeited all its dramatic breathlessness, all its moral aspiration, all its piety and potential wisdom. It would be an abstract intellect without a spiritual life, a hypostasis of the realm of truth or of essence, and not a human virtue, so that the dependence of spirit on animal life is no brutal accident, no inexplicable degradation of a celestial being into the soul of a beast. All the themes and passions of spirit, however spiritual or immaterial in themselves, celebrate the vicissitudes of a natural psyche, like a pure poet celebrating the adventures of lovers and kings.